Hi and welcome to the 5th episode of Beating BDD, a new podcast about body dysmorphic disorder from the BDD Foundation in the UK. My name's Claire Atherton and my guest for this episode is Callum Murphy. Having finished a course of CBT therapy for his BDD just a few months ago, Callum's got some really interesting things to say about what recovery means for him. As he puts it in his advice to listeners, don't wait for yourself to feel like you look any different. Just wait until you don't feel you look like anything. When you get that peace and quiet, you're probably on the right track. Here's his interview. Callum, thank you very much for coming in.
Hello, Claire. Thank you.
It was really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you properly.
So the last time I saw you, you were sitting on a stage in front of what must have been, 500 people or something, talking about your experience of BDD at the international conference, BDD Foundation conference. What was that like?
It was actually quite all right. It was really empowering. Before we started, we described ourselves as the BDD Avengers. And it was like we were at Comic-Con or something like that, but obviously talking about things that were much more intense.
When you were speaking at the conference, you were talking about having ended your therapy relatively recently. How would you say that you feel now compared to how you felt at the beginning of your treatment?
I would say I just feel continually surprised that every day can be a different experience rather than just every day feeling so painfully the same. And that feeling of being so stuck doesn't feel like that anymore. I used to wake up every day and feel like my entire body and life was a dread space.
Yeah.
It was a feeling that I'd had since I was really young, just waking up when you've got that pang of anxiety and nausea and that kind of whirring stress. And now if I wake up feeling like that, I feel much more able to dissect it and deal with it and not put it aside, but just try and understand it, but then try and make it understand that I've got things I need to be doing.
Yeah.
My experiences in my life are much more full and colourful and often include a lot more of my friends who I spent a long time isolating myself from.
Yeah, that sounds like a wonderful transformation.
Yeah, it is. And something that comes up a lot that came up a lot in my course of therapy was this idea of self-focused attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd go about my life as though I was watching myself from all of my very worst angles at all times and constantly worrying about, well, who's looking at me from this angle? What are they thinking? They're thinking exactly what I'm thinking. Everyone knows that these issues that I feel are there, and that doesn't give you any time to actually experience your day because you're so busy watching yourself from your most unflattering perspectives. But now I can sometimes get through the day and I think, I didn't have that once.
Oh, that's great.
But yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. You also said something that I find quite interesting at the event where you talked about the fact that exposure therapy had meant you were experiencing some sort of little differences in the things that you were noticing around you, for example, the way you were more present, I suppose, in the world.
Yeah, I think a lot of my BDD, like with that experience of walking around constantly focused on myself, it was the speed of the thought, especially like the destructive thought processes that were just completely ingrained in my habit, being able to slow those down and work them out. And when you kind of have moments of slowness, you can be more still and you can notice, you can just notice the pleasant things about your experience rather than be constantly critiquing yourself in your experience.
Yeah, sure. That's really interesting. So can we go back then to when you were a child? So I'm not sure exactly when your BDD came on, but before it came on, what kind of person were you? You would say, what sort of child were you?
I think I was a very sweet child. I think I was well liked. I always seemed to get on very well with people's parents. And I had lots of fun, I had good friends, but I always had this feeling of, for some reason, being just other than everybody else, and that everyone else was in on something that I wasn't, in terms of everyone else seems like they're having fun and they're not thinking about it, whereas I was very conscious and very aware of myself. I think I was a very self-aware child and quite a sensible child in terms of not really wanting to break the rules or cause trouble. I think I was very worried about keeping things levelled.
Do you think then, looking back, that sort of concern and that sort of consciousness of people in the world around you might have been a predisposing factor?
I think during my therapy, it was described as a perfect storm of me being a perfectionist, very concerned with the aesthetics of my life and lots of OCD type tendencies. So I was always doing strange little things which were probably very cute to look at, but were actually probably really stressful for me.
Yeah.
And I think it just a mixture of making sense of my environment and my living situations, which were good but challenging in all ways that everyone's growing up is challenging. And I think that maybe my way of dealing with the stresses in my life was to try and make myself perfect in order to neutralise the things that didn't feel perfect.
Do you remember what age you were when you first started to have sort of BDD thoughts and symptoms?
I would say not the such aggressive symptoms, but I remember being really, really young, and I have very curly hair and my younger brother has straight hair, and just being completely fixated on I should have straight hair. All the cool boys have straight hair. Why do I not have straight hair? Or even asking my younger brother, who was a little bit more, he was a bit naughtier than I was, teach me how to be cool. Or I was always waiting or expecting to be happier when I was someone else. And for me, the idea of growing up was, oh, when I grow up, I'll look like this person and I'll act like that person and I'll be able to interact like those people. And it just felt like I was going to have that sort of metamorphosis butterfly moment, and I don't know, I would emerge a star, something like that.
Funnily enough, I thought I was going to turn out to be Olivia Newton-John, so there you go.
Not bad.
Not bad, yeah.
No.
So as you got older then, how would you say those feelings changed sort of as you entered adolescence, for example? What happened then?
Well, there was definitely a blend of what I now understand to have been body dysmorphic disorder, but also completely debilitating anxiety set in, that was an anxiety that was blended with, I suppose, my coping strategies of using OCD behaviours, which made my life and my family's life very, very difficult. So, and still was maintaining good friendships, reasonably good grades at school, a reasonably good quality of life, but just would be constantly up in the middle of the night thinking I needed to twist the taps extremely hard to make sure the house didn't flood, or getting all the electrical appliances switched off properly, or checking that my younger brother was still breathing in his sleep, or tapping things a certain number of times. And I think before the body image stuff set in, it was more of just a generalised panic about needing to be in control of things, which was really, really hard.
So when the BDD symptoms started, how did they manifest themselves?
I think my first experience with really knowing that the issue was something to do with my physicality was I'd always, since I was a child, like really young child, been completely convinced I was really fat. I was always really fat, and I actually wasn't until I was kind of a bit puppy fattish in my teenage years. And when I was around 14, I just decided, well, I'm just not going to eat. And that was a very quick and sudden change. I lost a lot of weight very, very quickly, and was just completely obsessed with how finally I'd had a control over something that I'd been so concerned about for such a long time. And it felt like a bit of a game in my head. Like, it gave me a chance to redefine who I was going to be. And the control over the weight was the real starting factor in it becoming a big problem.
But then what happened? I suppose you lost all the weight, and so in theory you were where you wanted to be. What happened then?
Well, I'd always been self-conscious of my face and my nose especially, and kind of the shape of my mouth and indents in my forehead and all these kind of things. And the weight was lost, and then I thought, okay, well, now when I'm older I'll have some sort of surgery and then I really can be perfect. I can get this sorted out. And my last few years at secondary school, they went well. I had a fantastic group of friends that I still have now, and I properly turned towards performing and was in musicals and plays with my friends and at school. And I ended up going to the Brit School for Performing Arts in South London and having a really great time there, but being really unhappy, and I never got to fully enjoy it because I was just so confused about everything, and I was still very, very underweight. And it manifested in ways of I'd never let people take a picture of me, or I'd only take pictures of myself from a certain angle. And a big factor that I think made it go from just primarily a weight issue that I was tackling with was sort of the first time I ever had sort of a boyfriend. Just that feeling of I want to be perfect for this person. I want to be just like that person, which I know is not how everyone else thinks, but that was where my head would take me. And then it became extremely focused on my features and what it was that was wrong with them, what it was that had always been wrong with them, and what I could do to change them.
And what sort of behaviours were you and coping strategies were you using then? Were you a mirror checker or a mirror avoider?
I think the behaviours that kind of came was I withdrew from my life. I completed my time at the Brit School successfully and just decided, I'm not going to go to uni. I'm going to find out what I want to do after a year, and then I'll go to university. And things just continued to slip from there. And the further away I got from any idea of who I wanted to be, the more that all turned around as, well, it's because of your defects, or because you're so unattractive and so unlovable. And so it would become things like I was constantly pressing down on my nose to think I was going to try and change the shape of it, or I would do things like I'd walk into a room making sure that I was holding a certain book or wearing a certain thing just to present the self that I wanted to have presented and not be defined by all the things that I thought were wrong with me. And that progressed as I got a little bit older into just using drugs and alcohol really heavily at the weekend to try and have that escapism feeling, which eventually just made everything worse. I would go through either lots of checking of the mirror or complete avoidance. And something I found really difficult was a constant comparison of myself and other people. When I would see someone who I found more attractive than I deemed myself to be, I would feel ashamed that they had to look at me. And I would literally feel this pang in my stomach and would put my head down and just want to fade away, which is horrible. All of those things just kind of compacted me further and further into myself and led me away from my friends and led me away from recreational drugs into more just never an addicted territory, but just a really bad mishandling of self-medicating and isolating myself even further, and self-harm. Unfortunately, there was a lot of kind of binge eating and purging and laxative uses and just very, very fraught times.
It must have been really worrying for your friends and family as well. How were they responding throughout that period?
I think for a long time it flew under the radar because I was keeping to myself and keeping everything quite close to the chest. Probably not as close as I thought I was. I think it was very worrying for my parents to just see me really shutting down. And that's how it felt. It was just all the colour was draining from my life. I had no idea what I could do or what I wanted to do. And to be honest, I just felt like I didn't want to do anything anymore. I think it was more challenging for my friends because just the more self-conscious I got, the nastier I became. I think because I felt so insecure that unfortunately that came out in ways of just being cruel in certain situations and hurtful for no real reason.
Do you think your friends did understand, though, what was behind it all? I mean, to what extent did you talk to them about how you were feeling and the way your thought process were going inside your head?
My friends had a really good understanding. Since I was really young, I've had the same sort of group of core friends, and the idea of me talking about my insecurities with my appearance was something that would just always come up. I'd never want a picture taken. I'd be extremely uncomfortable if someone was to compliment me on anything. So they really did have an understanding. There was a WhatsApp group going on between my mum and my friends, and it was actually my friends that watched the BBC documentary Ugly Me and put their heads together and said, this is exactly what Callum talks about all of the time. The magnitude of the distress over something that the majority of people would just be like, okay, maybe that's just how I look. And my distress, they could compare it to what they saw in the documentary, and they took that documentary to my mum, and she said, yep, this is what's happened in here.
What a nice group of friends.
Yeah, they're a strong group of friends.
Yeah, they sound lovely. Did you sort of have a sense that there was actually something wrong, or did you always think, well, if my looks were fixed, I would feel better, this problem wouldn't exist?
I knew there was something wrong because there was no way that I should have been reacting to the way I felt I looked in such a strong way. I knew it didn't make sense, but it was the only sense I was living in, so...
And you mentioned earlier having a boyfriend. What happened with those? Did you continue to have relationships?
No. It could have been anything or anyone, and I think it was just that first idea of an attraction and a love, and then a rejection that was just a confirmation of all of these things that I already felt about myself. No, unfortunately, it really dragged me away from the idea of myself as someone with a partner, which is not how I feel anymore, luckily.
No, good.
Yeah.
Would you say that you had a kind of Eureka moment or a rock bottom moment with your BDD where you felt that, because obviously your friends and family had sort of found the documentary, but did you need to get to a point first where you accepted that you needed help? And if so, what was that moment?
It wasn't really one moment. It was just an endless cycle of moments. But a period that I find was probably like the crux of when I knew everything had to change, was I think I was probably about 22, and I was working for my family company in an industry that isn't probably where I'm going to end up, and probably could have been somewhere that someone else could have thrived if it had been more in line with their interests and they weren't really suffering with body dysmorphic disorder. And I was just completely in a rut. I wasn't spending any time socialising or respecting my talents or my aspirations or my health or myself. And I was kind of really plodding along miserably and didn't think things could possibly get any worse than the way I'd already felt about myself. And then I found out that I was losing my hair due to hereditary means, and my hair had literally been the only thing about myself since I was maybe 13 when I properly let it grow. That was the one thing I was like, yeah, I really like my hair. My hair was just like this big lion's mane of corkscrews in this coppery colour. And when I found that out and I went very full in, I was like, get me to Harley Street. I need to know exactly what's happening. And I'd already been to Harley Street a few times for some other consultations. And I just completely shut down. It was definitely, I want to kill myself. I'm so not equipped for this. It was, if I lose my hair, I will die. Because I'm already so uncomfortable with myself as it is. And if I have to lose, in my mind, it was going to be, within a couple of months, you are going to be a bald 22-year-old. Which for me, just, it did not fly. And it was horrific. The way I kept looking at it, it was like it was a cosmic joke. It was like, okay, I get it. This is the final thing that just says, maybe you're not meant to be here. Maybe this life wasn't for you. And I think the unfortunate part was that for me, that final straw of, well, now you'll be losing your hair, was sort of like a checking out notice. It was like, okay, I'm done, and maybe I'm okay with that. But my mum really wasn't okay with that when I asked.
Understandably.
Yeah, when I asked for permission to basically ask for permission to kill myself, and she just was like, "What are you talking about? Of course I can't say yes to that request," which is completely understandable.
How did you get from that point to then seeking help and having the therapy?
from that point, it's all actually quite a bit of a blur. And it was actually probably a longer amount of time than I remember it being now. I basically feel like I plodded on for as long as I could. And I eventually got me a consultation at, I think it was the Priory, with Professor David Ville, who basically was just like, yep, you absolutely have body dysmorphic disorder. We'll put you on the waiting list for cognitive behavioural therapy at the Maudsley. And it was pretty bleak between that time and the start of the treatment. I'd been in and out of therapy, I think, since I was about 12 or 13. And they were more to do with generalised anxiety issues and depression and low mood. And I'd had a round of what I'm assuming was very expensive therapy about a year before, probably about a year and a half before I started my CBT at the Maudsley, which, although it was clearly really well thought out and he was a great psychiatrist, there was no penetrating the issue of how I felt in my life if I felt like I didn't even want to be in my body in this life. So every time that a conversation would come up about how I could make things more manageable for myself, it's like I had an armour that was saying, no, this is just not possible.
How then was the Maudsley approach different?
It forced me to be a lot more selective with where my thoughts were going and where the conversation would go in those sessions. And those constricts meant that I really had to dial down onto all of the things that were the stems of the issues, or were the triggers in the situations, or were the things that consistently drag me backwards after a bit of progression. And looking at it like a roadmap and like training, it was different in that sense. It was, I knew I would be going into my sessions and there was a game plan. It wasn't just come in to the session and talk about how awful your week has been. It was an intense amount of homework and needing to listen back to audio recordings of yourself and your doctor from the session, and having to listen back to an hour's worth of yourself pulling yourself to pieces in the brutalist ways possible. After an amount of time, you start to think, how dare this person say that about me? And then you realise you are that person. Yeah, I think it was the structure of the help I got at the Maudsley that was so different.
How many sessions do you think you had, roughly?
I think I had 12.
So that's really not very many, is it, for you to sort of be feeling so much better? So what do you think for you the secret of the success was?
I think the secret of the success, or I kind of feel a bit nervous calling it success, just in case anything is to change. But the secret of the improvements so far are dedication to it, time and space to really do the work. I was unfortunate enough to need to be signed off sick from work, but fortunate enough to have the time off of work to really dedicate, I think it's probably the last 6.5, 7 months, just to reintegrating myself back into a life that I wanted. And I know that not everybody will have the opportunity to make their mental health their priority because they need to keep a roof over their head and need to feed themselves and their families. But I was really fortunate enough to be able to just focus on getting myself well again, or probably not even well again, just well.
Were there any particular things that you found difficult or that you found to be particularly effective during the course of the treatment?
Something that was really challenging for me and still is was this concept of there being a theory A and a theory B approach to body image related issues, which is theory A, I am ugly, I am the problem, it is a physical problem, and theory B being, I feel like I'm ugly, I am not the problem, my way of thinking about this is the problem. And for CBT to work, it sort of feels like you're doing everything opposite to what your BDD mind is telling you, because you just have to say, well, I'll just believe that it is a thinking issue, even though I know for a fact that it's a physical issue. And that just continues to revolve around until eventually you start to get some of the tools that you're learning through the therapy ingrained, and you're able to have some space between your thoughts, and all of a sudden, when you're hearing those self-deprecating thoughts and self-criticisms, you can sort of brush them aside before they get too powerful.
What about the kind of, we talked about this earlier, that they didn't use the word exposure particularly, but the sort of exposure therapy that you needed to do, what kind of thing did you have to do?
My exposures were never so much kind of needing to get out of the house, because I'd managed to stay getting out of the house, but it was exposing myself to neutralising my responses to the things that stressed me out outside of the house. So I think my main exposures were things like forcing myself to keep my head held high as I walked down the street, so that if anyone was to walk past me and see me, they could see me fully, and that would need to be okay. And making sure that I didn't position my head in a certain way when going past a certain place, or actually maybe I did have more exposures than I thought. I'd gotten into a habit of avoiding my local train station because I didn't want anyone from my upbringing to see me in this monstrous state that I felt like I'd fallen into. So I used to get a really long bus journey to work, and just one day I said no, even though I wasn't working at this point. But I just said no, like, I need to live my life, and eventually that just gets a bit easier.
Something else you said at the conference I thought was really interesting about exposure therapy being a game of levels. What did you mean by that?
What I meant by that was, if I felt like I could imagine my experience with BDD as this awful casing around me and my life and my opportunities, and with every push or opposite action you take against the things that BDD makes you want to do, it's almost like you get that level unlocked moment, and part of the barrier disintegrates, and you get to walk through it and go on to your next challenge. And that idea of leveling up was just so satisfying. Every time I did something that I would have never done, maybe even a few months before, it just felt like weight off of my back that meant I could just walk forward more freely.
You also mentioned having got involved in some kind of study, BDD study. What was that?
So I had a really great opportunity. I met someone who actually also spoke at the conference called, probably going to butcher her second name, Nicole Schnackenberg.
Oh, yes.
And we met at a help group, and somehow it ended up that I would be a participant in a study for a program called Eat, Breathe, Thrive, which is a framework of yoga and meditation and chanting aimed at getting you back into your physical body and appreciating all the things that your body can do rather than just the way that it looks. It was run by the University of Buffalo in New York, so I think it was about a 7-week course of yoga and meditation and exploring kind of society's ideals of the perfect body or what bodies should be, and re-exploring the things that our bodies do for us naturally that are so important that when you're completely consumed by a body image issue, you can't focus on. So kind of Eat, Breathe, Thrive is a way of getting you back into your body.
Was it helpful for you?
It was very helpful for me, and that was actually before I started my CBT. So it was it's helpful for me in a different way, yeah.
So now that you're done with therapy, my understanding is that the idea is you're supposed to carry on being your own therapist. How are you managing to do that? Are you managing to do that okay?
I believe I am managing to do it okay. I make sure to give myself the space that I need, and if I don't give myself that space, I can really feel it. Even from things as simple as not giving myself endless lists of things to do that don't give me any time to focus on my well-being. One way of being my own therapist is really making sure to check in with how I'm feeling in any given moment. I'm really recently out of my therapy, and I can definitely feel there's a hesitation and a resistance to really do the heavy work of my relapse prevention plan. I can feel I'm hesitant to look at it because I'm almost scared that it's going to drag me back into those old ways. So I haven't done it by the book yet, but just making sure that the second I notice that I'm uncomfortable, I unpack the reasons why and don't let it simmer.
Yeah, absolutely. Given that you had sort of symptoms of BDD for quite a long time before you had treatment, how would you say it's affected your sort of sense of self having gone through treatment and being in recovery? What's it done to your identity?
That's something I keep asking myself, because it kind of feels like a death and a rebirth, and a death and a rebirth. It's just having to start to view yourself in a different way after such a long time is really scary. And one of the reasons I think that my situation had gone on for such a long time was because even though it was so uncomfortable, I probably wasn't very scared of it anymore. And now the wide open spaces can feel quite daunting, but they're so much more important than those cramped, confined spaces that you stay in for such a long time. And again, with the idea of levels and games, you just kind of have to keep playing the game.
Is there anything else you think you enjoy now that you wouldn't have enjoyed before?
I enjoy being less controlled in my everyday life. One of the ways that I would try and regulate my stress and my anxiety would be to just really do nothing. I'd go to work, I'd come home, I'd ended up taking sleeping pills earlier and earlier in the evening just to sort of get that day over with and revolve into the next one. And now just things as simple as meeting a friend somewhere a little bit further out, or taking myself to the cinema when I wasn't expecting to, or just being more spontaneous and being able to do that. I think I'm being able to enjoy so many parts of life now that were just completely blank for me beforehand.
And finally, what would you say to someone who's where you were back in the worst days, someone who's really in the grip of BDD? Have you got any particular advice?
The most truthful advice I can give will be that it might not be about the process you go on in your recovery and in your treatment might not be about an eventual change in the way you feel like you look, but a change in the way that you accept the way you feel like you look. I feel much better a lot of the time now, and that doesn't now mean that I feel like I look like a 90s Leonardo DiCaprio. It just means that I have a space and a separation from that churning ball of horribleness. I think that's a really long-winded bit of advice.
That's good.
But just, I think my advice would be, don't wait for yourself to feel like you look different. Wait for yourself to not feel like you look like anything. And when you get that peace and quiet, you're probably on the right track.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Callum. It was just really lovely to hear your story. You're so articulate in the way you tell it, and you've been so honest, so I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. I found it really moving, and I'm so pleased that Callum's been able to make such great progress. You can tell us what you think and keep an eye out for more episodes by following the BDD Foundation on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. We're also on major podcast apps like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher and Podbean, and you can find us on Spotify too. So that's it for today. Until next time, remember that this podcast isn't therapy, so please do seek help from a trained professional. Thanks for listening.